Tanjo, Volume 1, 7 Shadows. Chapter 5, The Village. Dawn brushed the mountainside, light spilling between the trees and breaking against the small home carved into the slope. Snow clung stubbornly to the earth, patches of white refusing to surrender. From the eaves came a steady drip, tapping against the wooden rail, sharp, hollow notes that froze to glassy beads clinging along the grain. Below, the creek had stilled, its voice of rushing water silenced by winter's hold. Beneath a thin skin of ice, pockets of frozen bubbles gleamed like glass beads, caught mid-breath, suspended between motion and stillness. Inside, Tanjo stirred on her tatami mat, half awake, with little sleep, eyes tracing the faint light spilling through the paper screens. The house was quiet, but not silent. She heard her mother rise first, soft steps crossing toward the fire pit, the gentle rustle of kindling being set. Then her father's weight followed, heavier, deliberate, floorboards giving under him. Tanjo lay staring at the cedar beams that held the roof up. Layered blankets of fur and linen had kept the night's chill at bay, though warmth sometimes pressed too close, forcing her feet to stretch out from beneath the covers to find relief. Around her, the circle of siblings still slept. Now, sprawled with his covers slipped away, already grumbling in his half-dream. Azande curled to one side, face buried in her arm. The twins tangled their legs like vines, whispering even in sleep. Tanjo squinted, her brows knitting as she watched the twins rustle against each other. How can they sleep like that? She thought, half amused, half bewildered. She pushed herself up slowly, the fur-lined pillow slipping from beneath her neck. Fingers worked the linen and hide into neat folds, pressing them flat against the tatami until no crease remained. She bowed once over the bundled bedding, more instinct than thought, then set it aside. Rising to her feet, she padded softly across the boards to the water bucket waiting near the wall, filled and ready from the night before. She cupped her hands, dipped them deep, and lifted the chill to her face. The shock bit instantly, running from her palms to her cheeks. She held it there a moment longer than needed, forcing her breath to steady. Droplets traced her jaw and neck before vanishing into her robe. Tanjo slipped into her red kimono, the fabric soft against her skin, its hem brushing the tatami as she tied the sash tight around her waist. The crimson caught the first light spilling across the paper screens, a pulse of color against the pale dawn. Behind her, the room stirred awake. A bundle of linen hakama arced through the air, landing squarely on Azande's face. She groaned, rolling over with a muffled yawn. "Stop," she muttered, voice thick with sleep. Now smirked, already on his feet. He padded across the boards and dunked his hands into the bucket, splashing water against his face and armpits with no care for the spray. Drops scattered across the floorboards in wild little arcs. Azande rolled her eyes at the lack of care. The twins were next, scrambling over each other to reach the bucket first. Their laughter broke the hush of morning as they splashed and shoved, dripping trails of cold across the mats. Azande finally dragged herself upright, hair tangled, her scowl deepening as she trudged to the water with heavy steps. She took a slender kanzashi and spun her hair into a bun with practiced ease, fixing it in place with the same steady motion each morning. Tanjo stepped into the main room, bowing lightly toward her mother by the fire. "Oha, mamo," she said softly, pressing a kiss to her cheek. Ayoka's smile carried more warmth than the fire itself. She touched Tanjo's arm, her voice low and fond. "Oha, my love." The siblings filed in behind her. The twins, as always, greeted with a bow and a kiss on their mother's cheek, their movements quick and light. Now followed, folding deep into a bow before scooping Ayoka into a playful hug that lifted her tiny frame from the floor. "Put me down," she said, calm but firm, though her laughter betrayed how much she loved it. He kissed her forehead. "Oha, mamo," he teased, setting her back onto her feet before she could reach for her chopsticks to pinch his arm. He ducked away quickly, grinning at the narrow escape. "Oha, my love," Ayoka called after him, chopsticks raised in mock threat. "Move," Azande chimed in, nudging past her brother as she padded across the floor to greet Ayoka. Still half asleep but steady, she bowed low, pressed a quiet kiss to her mother's cheek, and said nothing. "Oha, my love?" Ayoka teased, the question in her tone. "Oha, mamo. I'm tired," Azande murmured back, voice low and weighty. The siblings pulled on their boots and lifted their swords from the wooden rack nearest the sliding door. Belts tightened, sayas secured at their sides. Outside, their father already stood waiting, a line traced in the snow before him. They took their places in silence, breath misting in the morning air. Snow drifted lightly, catching on the edges of unsheathed blades. Now stepped forward to lead first form, steady and precise, each cut etched into the morning air. Every morning at dawn, as far back as Tanjo could remember, this had been their ritual. Beyond 10,000 hours, past practice, past repetition, it had become part of their marrow. The rhythm of breath and blade lived in their DNA now, unshakable. Steel cut the air in perfect unison. Huh, huh. Their voices broke the silence of the forest, sharp exhalations with every strike. Stance to stance, thrust and recover, forward and back. The sound of snow shifting beneath their boots marked the passage of hours. Yasuke watched in silence, arms folded, his presence heavy as stone. If form wavered, now corrected. Tanjo followed, her blade steady, her movements precise. But something pressed in her chest, an urge that refused to stay still. As the kata ended and her sword settled back to guard, she shifted, letting the blade flow instead of halt. Her wrist turned, the sword tracing behind her back, then sweeping forward again in a single, fluid arc. "Wait," Now said, lowering his blade. His brow furrowed, but not in disapproval. "Let me see that again." The siblings formed a loose circle, blades drawn, eyes on Tanjo. She breathed, centered, then repeated the motion, clean, smooth, water folding over stone. This time, they followed. Hesitant at first, then quicker. The rhythm caught. The circle moved as one, their katanas cutting in fluid succession, an orchestra of steel, discipline tempered by flow. "Nice," Now said, shaking his head with a rare smile of approval. Then Yasuke stood. The five reset back into first form, knowing correction was coming. Their father's steps carried him to the center of the courtyard with slow, deliberate weight. His gaze swept across each of them, sharp and steady. "I love that you are experimenting," he said, voice carrying the weight of stone. "But never forget, it is the simplest forms that decide life and death in battle." Now bowed in agreement. Tanjo couldn't help but roll her eyes. "We've been doing the same thing for years," she muttered under her breath. Yasuke's gaze lingered on her, though his tone stayed even. "You heard Kenji's mourning last night. Today, we will be fortifying the house. along with the duties your mother has set for you. His voice dropped into final command. Now, return to guard. First, form into final form. Bow. Then we work. Blades burst forward in unison. Phew! The sound cut the morning air. A twist back into guard, a sweep rising and falling, then the final breath of motion. In unison, the swords slid into their sayas and were carried inside, placed upon their resting stand near the entry. There was a sense of tension in the air. Father was quiet, quieter than he usually was. The tasks had been assigned for the day, now worked beside Yasuke, chiseling joinery for the top beams of the stone wall that was slowly rising around the courtyard. It wasn't high, just to the chin, but high enough to turn the house into a keep. Father corrected with patience, guiding Nao's grip, steadying the angle of each strike. Teacher and son, rhythm and stone. The woodpile fell to Azande that day, a task Father trusted her to meet with her usual stubborn will. She seized the axe leaning against the wall and lifted it high. Each swing landed sharp and certain, splitting the logs clean. Snow and splinters burst with every strike, scattering across the snow. She hardly paused, splitting log after log with the same relentless energy she carried into everything. The palms of her hands had grown calloused and torn, yet she drove the axe down again and again, as if stopping were never an option. Inside, the twins busied themselves, one humming softly as she worked, the other focused and silent. Akimi sat poised with needle and thread, patching worn garments. What seemed tedious to the others was her meditation, her fingers slipping through cloth with quiet certainty, her gaze drifting through the paper screens as though half dreaming, yet never pricking herself once. When she finished a garment, it almost looked new. You couldn't tell where the patch began and the fabric ended. Yas, look! Akimi held up the mended garment, proud of her work. The tear from Yuzari's last trip into the woods was gone, stitched so neatly it was hard to tell it had ever been there. Wow, that looks perfect, Twinsy, Yuzari said with a grin. Try not to rip it again, Akimi warned, mock serious. That one was a nightmare to fix. I won't, Yuzari promised, already striding over to grab it from her sister's hands. Hey! Akimi yelped, startled. What? I'm just going to try it on. Yuzari slipped the garment over her shoulder, already half turned toward the corner to change. Before she could get far, Ayoka's voice cut through from across the room. Yuzari, back here. You can try it on after you finish what you were doing. Yuzari groaned, rolling her eyes, but trudged back, still clutching the garment like a prize. Yuzari worked beside Mother, the two of them flowing back into harmony, humming a soft tune as they crushed herbs and prepared meat and roots for the evening meal. Her hands moved in quiet rhythm, steady as breath, while her voice threaded softly through the room, an old melody, older than she was, carried on her mother's lips before her. Together they worked as though they had always shared this song, two notes woven into the same line. Mamo, that's the wrong note, Yuzari teased, laughter bubbling in her voice. Ayoka snatched up the chopsticks, brandishing them like tiny swords and pointing them at her daughter in mock warning. Keep it up, she said, raising an eyebrow and smiling despite herself. Even with the note still slightly off, the two kept singing, louder now, their voices mingling with laughter as the house filled with music. Outside, the sound of blade against whetstone rasped from the side of the house, steady and unbroken. The motion was simple but unforgiving. Too much pressure could ruin the edge, too little left it dull. Back and forth, sliding and checking, the rhythm demanded patience. Father insisted every blade gleam pristine, so that both the maker's craft and the wielder's spirit shone in the steel. Her mind often wandered while she worked, but the task always pulled her back. Precision left no room for drifting. Each pass had to balance the blade, sharpness equal on both sides, curve unbroken. In the early years, her shoulders had ached from the strain. Now, after countless hours, the weight of it lived in her muscles. The ache was long gone. Hours passed as the family moved through their duties, the house filled with the quiet industry of survival. When the chime finally rang, it was Ayoka's signal for tea. She laid the handmade cups on the porch, steam rising from the fragrant leaves of sencha. Afternoon tea was always a welcome pause, a ritual as steady as the morning forms. It marked a moment to breathe, to share warmth, and sometimes to slip away into the woods. Tanjo drank quickly, the steam still curling from her cup, and reached for her blade as her eyes flicked toward the forest path. She had just stepped to the porch when Father's voice caught her. "Tanjo, not anymore. Not alone." She stood still, the words heavy in the air. Then her head dropped. Turning back up the porch, she slid the sword into its place on the rack. With a long sigh, she sat on the steps instead, her gaze fixed on the tree line, watching the forest, her sanctuary, her freedom. The pause before evening training carried her toward the creek, just beyond the courtyard, close enough to obey Father's eye, yet far enough to feel like escape. She longed for the forest, for its freedom, but instead felt suspended, frozen in place like the water sealed beneath the creek's ice. A sudden warmth swept across her legs. Mochi had found her, the family's white cat winding in slow, deliberate circles, her tail ribboning through the cold air as her small body pressed close, purring against her shins. Tanjo bent to scoop her up, pressing her cheek against Mochi's soft coat, breathing in the faint warmth of fur. Mochi blinked with her usual indifference, the kind of freedom no one else in the house could claim. She came and went as she pleased, sometimes returning with unwelcome trophies of mice or sparrows, other times curling into Akimi's lap as she sewed, or leaping into the rafters to bat at the herbs that hung drying from the beams. Days would pass when she vanished into the forest entirely, returning only when hunger pulled her home. Unbound, unruled, free. Tanjo sighed, stroking Mochi's back. One day, she thought. By dusk, the 5 of them lined up once again, blades drawn, moving through the first form all the way to the 12th, the final stance. Now led once more, his voice sharp, his movements precise. But tension stirred as he caught his sisters lagging, less rigid, less focused than he demanded. His eyes widened in silent rebuke, as if to say, "I know you know this. Come on." His sisters returned only with their own brand of rebellion. A glance too casual, a smirk at the corner of a mouth, the dramatic roll of eyes, or the infamous side glare that answered without words. Tanjo caught the edge of their silent exchange with a grin, but her gaze lifted past them to the sky, already deepening into purples and pinks, fine snow drifting like falling ash. The warmth of the sun surrendered to the shade of the forest and the looming ridge. Dusk had begun. They all looked forward to the moment the sun kissed the ridge and slipped into shadow. That was when Ayoka would ring the chime, her clear note carrying across the courtyard to invite them back inside. "Final form," Father's voice called. Together they moved, one breath, one motion, ending the day as they had begun. The days folded into weeks, each one marked by the same cycle: training, fortifying, training, dinner. A rhythm that steadied the house, but did little to ease the growing strain. Kenji's warning, once sharp as steel, dulled with time. The urgency faded, leaving only echoes. And into that silence, tension crept. The twins, who once moved like mirrors, began to bicker. Small sparks that lit into quarrels. Azande's words to Tanjo grew sharper, her patience thinning. Now withdrew further, burying himself in scrolls and forms, his silence heavier than any reprimand. Ayoka watched. She always watched. And when her children frayed, she knew the cure. Not a lecture, not more drills. Shoji. The wooden board came out, its grid etched deep from years of play. The moment she set it on the mat, the air shifted. On the board, battles replaced their bickering. The twins forgot their spats, leaning shoulder to shoulder as they argued over moves. Azande's sharpness turned into strategy, her eyes narrowing in calculation instead of irritation. Even now, usually sealed away in training or buried in books, joined the fray, quiet at first, then leaning in, voice steady as he plotted counters. The house filled with the rhythm of play, the tap of pieces, the quick intake of breath before a bold move, the burst of laughter when a mistake was caught. But the best nights were when Ayoka and Yasuke sat across from one another. The siblings gathered close, circling the board as though it were an arena. The girls cheered each time Ayoka captured a piece, their voices sharp with delight. Now allowed himself the smallest smile when Yasuke countered, reclaiming ground with patient precision. Then, quietly, without fanfare, Ayoka slid her final piece into place. The board fell still. Yasuke's hand hovered above the grid, but there was nowhere left to move. Ayoka rose with a calm smile, leaned down to kiss her husband's cheek, and whispered, "It's your turn to do the dishes." The girls erupted in laughter, falling against each other with glee. Now leaned into his father's shoulder, voice low and teasing. "Nice try, father. Nice try." Yasuke studied the board one last time, nodding with the dignity of a man who was usually victorious, but had been outplayed. He turned toward Ayoka, his bow slight but proud, pride flickering in his eyes as he met his wife's. The grin that followed was quiet surrender. But even as laughter lingered, Tanjo caught her father's expression. Yasuke's face held a worried smile, not from losing to Ayoka, but as if he were about to lose something else. His brows furrowed in that subtle way she had come to know too well. Something unsettled in him, faint but undeniable. A quiet unease that clung like a shadow. Tanjo studied him from across the room as he began to make his way to the kitchen. As the night deepened, Ayoka moved through the house in her quiet ritual. She carried a small flame from lamp to lamp, bowing her head as each one dimmed to darkness, resetting the home into stillness. Shadows stretched long across the paper walls until only the low glow of the hearth remained. Yasuke and Nao slipped into the cold beyond the door, their footsteps muted in snow as they circled the perimeter. A habit, a duty. Their silhouettes passed like ghosts across the frosted courtyard before vanishing into the tree line. Inside, Azande dragged her bedding from its place with little care, already half asleep, collapsing onto her side before the blankets were even pulled tight. The twins tucked in close beneath their shared furs, whispering in hushed voices about the game, replaying every clever move their mother had made against their father. Tanjo gathered her own bedding carefully. She laid the tatami mat flat, smoothing every fold before layering her blankets and fur with precision. She carried a single candle and 2 small pieces of wood to the sunken hearth in the siblings' room, coaxing a small flame to life. It caught slowly, smoke curling upward, filling the air with the scent of pine resin. The circle of warmth grew, pulling them all closer into its reach. It had been weeks since Tanjo last set foot in her forest sanctuary, the place where her blade moved like breath, and the wisp of her katana answered her back. Memories and longing returned as she lay on her tatami mat, eyes fixed on the small fire she had coaxed to life. The flames crackled softly, their amber light painting restless shadows across the walls. She longed for escape, for the cool hush of the pines, for the rhythm of steel and wind, instead of endless days spent sharpening blades and repeating the same drills. Even the thought of walking down to the village on some small errand felt like freedom, a chance to step beyond the weight pressing inside the house. Her gaze blurred in the fire's glow, lids growing heavy. The room softened around her. Breath by breath, the pull of sleep gathered her under, and at last she drifted into dream. Dawn seeped into the house like an echo of yesterday, the hours folding together until night and morning were one. Tanjo woke slowly, pulled from sleep not by light, but by the rasp of a tongue against her cheek. Warm, damp, rough as the whetstone she used to sharpen the blades. "Mochi, stop," she murmured, turning her head away. Mochi pressed closer, purring, her small body nudging insistently against Tanjo's cheek. With a sigh, Tanjo pushed her gently aside, half hoping she could drift back into sleep. In the hearth's glow, Mochi's small form stretched into a long shadow across the floor. Through the screens, the moonlight thinned, giving way to the pale glow of early morning. Tanjo sat up, careful, eyes scanning the room. Her siblings remained bundled in their bedding, breaths soft and even. Her parents had not yet stirred. She quietly slipped from her covers and folded them neatly, rolling the mat and tucking it into its place. Her hands found the red kimono, then the scarf, layering warmth against the morning chill. With a quick twist, she gathered her hair into a top knot, securing it tight. Every movement was measured. Her feet found the wooden floor, and memory guided her. She knew which boards betrayed a step, which groaned loud enough to rouse her mother. At the weapon rack, her fingers closed around the familiar curve of her katana, its weight steady in her hand. The front door slid open with the faintest whisper. She held her breath, chest tight, lungs burning as though even air might give her away. She paused, turned once to glance back. Not a single body stirred. The house remained in silence. Mochi brushed past her feet as she slid the door shut, careful, deliberate, sealing the world inside. On the porch, she crouched to pull on her split-toe boots, tying them snug, as Mochi sat and waited, tail curled neatly around her paws, eyes bright with that quiet, cat-like insistence that asked without asking. One last glance toward the house, then down the steps. Snow crunched beneath her soles, the sound sharp in the hush. She froze, listening. The house gave no answer. No footsteps, no stirring. She exhaled, slow and steady. Tanjo sprinted toward the courtyard wall, boots striking the snow with soft bursts. Mochi darted after her, light as a shadow, pouncing at the trailing edge of Tanjo's scarf, then skipping sideways through the drifts as if the morning had become a game and Tanjo had finally agreed to play. 2 quick steps up the stone, a twist of her body, and Tanjo perched at the top, breath curling into the cold morning air. Mochi gathered herself below, hopping onto a lower stone, then another, front paws reaching, claws catching, a soft little scramble, determined to follow. Tanjo glanced back at the house, heart steady, ears straining. Nothing stirred. The silence held. A grin broke across her face. She leaned back and let herself fall, body flipping clean through the air. Her boots landed soundlessly in the drift below. Mochi landed a beat after, more clumsy than graceful, tumbling into the snow with a soft woof, then springing up as if nothing had happened, shaking white powder from her fur in a flurry. She bounded forward again, circling Tanjo's legs, brushing against her shin, then trotting ahead in short bursts, stopping just long enough to look back, as if to make sure Tanjo was still coming. "Finally," she whispered, the word slipping out like a secret carried on breath. She slipped into the forest, weight lifting from her chest with every step. The deeper she went, the lighter she felt, closer to the sanctuary that belonged only to her. Mochi followed for a while, playful, insistent, leaping onto fallen branches and sinking into drifts up to her belly, then bursting out again with bright-eyed indignation, as if winter itself had dared to touch her. But the forest always held other invitations. A faint rustle, a scent caught on the wind, something small moving under snow. Mochi slowed, her ears turned, sharp and precise, her head tilted. The play drained from her body as quickly as it had come, replaced by the sudden stillness of a hunter remembering what she was. She stared into the underbrush. Then, without apology, without farewell, Mochi slipped off the path and vanished between the trees. White fur swallowed by shadow and cedar, like she had never been there at all. "I thought we were hanging out, Momo," Tanjo said, smiling, watching her not even look back, already going deeper after her prey, disappearing into the forest. "Oh, like that?" Tanjo huffed a quiet laugh. "I see how it is." She shook her head, smiling. "Well then, bye, Mochi." She smiled to herself, soft, almost fond, and kept moving, deeper into the pines, where the world belonged to breath and steel and silence. Here, there were no corrections, no sharp looks, no rules, only the rhythm of her own movement. Her hands brushed the bark of familiar trees as she passed, fingers trailing across rough surfaces like she was greeting old friends. The trail she had carved day after day was hidden beneath snow, but her feet knew the way, carrying her with certainty until the trees broke open into the clearing. Tanjo lifted her gaze to the sky. Light filtered through the branches, soft and pale. Her shoulders loosened. The tension of the house slid from her bones. For the first time in weeks, peace found her. Her hand moved to the hilt of her blade. Steel whispered free of its saya, catching the early sun. Tanjo turned her body into the flow, feet shifting, shoulders rolling, her movements first deliberate, first form, and then breaking loose. The blade carved arcs through the air, scattering fine snow with each turn. Sunlight caught the edge, flashing like fire drawn from ice. Her breath rose and fell in rhythm, white clouds vanishing as fast as they formed. She spun, body low, then rose into a high cut, movement both sharp and fluid, as if she balanced on the edge between dance and battle. Each strike carried weight, yet each step glided, her motion fierce but unbroken. Snow leapt from the ground, stirred by her blade's passage, swirling like an orchestra of white around her. The clearing seemed to move with her, a private stage where beauty and danger were one. Here, she was not a student. She was not a child. She was only herself. The cold was a distant thing, forgotten. Shadows lengthened and bent across the snow, but she did not see them. She had been lost to the rhythm for hours, blade sweeping, breath steady, body folding again and again into final form. With one last cut, she sheathed her sword and bowed, as if to the quiet applause of the trees. A long sigh escaped her lips. Looks like I'm going to be splitting logs again. Tanjo turned to leave for home, the forest stillness clinging to her like a second skin, the cold crisp against her breath. Her eyes caught a flicker of green beneath a drift of snow, small buds pressing stubbornly through the frost. She knelt, brushing the snow aside, and smiled. Fuki no to, the early shoots her mother had spoken of. Bitter to the tongue, but prized in teas and tonics. The first sign of spring's defiance against winter. She gathered them carefully, tucking the stems into the fold of her red kimono, close to her chest. For a moment, the task felt grounding. Her mother would be pleased with this small gift of the season. And that was when she heard it. A scream tore through the hush. Human, raw, piercing. A jagged sound that did not belong to this forest. Though distant, the terror in the woman's voice carried, shattering the stillness. Tanjo froze mid-step. Her pulse thundered in her ears, each beat loud as a drum. Every muscle locked. Instinct dropped her into a crouch, back pressed tight to the rough flank of a cedar, her body half hidden by underbrush. She scanned the trees, breath shallow. The world narrowed to sound. But the forest only threw echoes back at her, twisting the cry until she couldn't tell from which direction it had come. Another cry split the air, sharper, shriller. A voice ragged with desperation. Then a second, lower, torn from deep in the chest. It broke off into silence. Sudden. Final. A silence that told her more than words could. Years of training wrapped around her limbs like instinct. She sank low, fingers brushing the earth as she crept forward on all fours. She paused beneath the sweep of a cedar, the underbrush pressing close around her. Breath locked in her ribs, she stilled. Listened. The forest, so welcoming moments before, had turned cold, watchful. Shadows shifted like eyes, every rustle a whisper of threat. Then it struck her. The cries, the chaos. It wasn't drifting in from somewhere in the woods. It rose up from the shallow valley below, from the village. The voices carried through the trees, rising into her forest like smoke. Tanjo kept to the slope of the land, angling toward the ridge where she knew she could glimpse the village, remaining unseen. Her body pressed close to the snow-covered ground, hands parting the brush in silence. Branches clawed at her sleeves as if to drag her back, pine needles whispering across her cheek. The snow gave just enough to swallow the sound of her movements, yet clung heavy to her clothing, anchoring her down. Still she pressed forward, every motion driven by the pounding of her heart and the distant clamor that carried through the trees. Screams and cries, faint but relentless. The scent reached her first. Ash, sharp and biting at the back of her throat. Then came the glow, flickering orange bleeding through the gaps in the trees, an unnatural fire against the darkening sky. Tanjo sank lower, chest pressed to the earth as she crawled the last stretch. Her elbows buried into the powder, her breath fogging across the snow. At the ridge she paused, the ground falling away in a soft slope scattered with pines that thinned toward the village below. She looked down. Where the village once stood, there was only chaos and ruin. A dozen rooftops burned, their frames splintered and sagging beneath the weight of flame. Smoke churned upward in thick, twisting columns, swallowing the stars, a black shroud drawn tight over the valley. But the fire was only the beginning. The true terror lay in what moved among the flames. They were everywhere, pouring through the village like a tide. Figures in white armor, once pristine, now streaked with soot and splattered dark with blood. They moved in numbers like swarming ants, the pale plates of their armor stark against the blackened streets and the red that slicked the snow. Dragon masks hid their faces, but nothing could hide the brutality in their movements. Quick, merciless. They flowed between buildings as if bound by one will, a single monstrous organism feeding on the ruin. Tanjo's breath caught, the cold and smoke burning her lungs. For a heartbeat, she couldn't move, her mind trying and failing to count the bodies on the ground. Her eyes darted along the red and white streets, tracking villagers and soldiers in a blur of flame and smoke. The metallic tang of blood clung to the back of her tongue. Heat from the fires rose along the ridge, pressing hot against her face even as the night air bit at her skin. This wasn't a raid. This was an ending. Kenji's prophecy. They had come. They dragged a villager into the open, barefoot, wrists bound, stumbling as his captors hauled him forward. His knees collapsed, striking the frozen stones of what had once been the town center, now slick with blood. 2 soldiers yanked him upright, forcing him to sway between them. The third advanced, sword tilted to catch the firelight, its edge gleaming. They barked questions at him, the words drowned by the crackle of burning timber and the screams that tore through the night. But Tanjo thought she understood. Between the chaos, a single phrase cut through. "Where is he?" The man's sobs shook his whole body, too ragged to shape into words. He lifted one trembling arm and pointed. Past the flames, past the ridge and the dark cut of the mountain. Past the crooked path that led toward the river, carving its way home. To her home. Cold washed through her, sharper than the air. She felt it first in her hands, a numbness that climbed her arms, then in the sudden thudding of her pulse in her ears. The thought was small, almost voiceless, but it struck like a blade. My family. The world tilted. Too much fire, too much smoke. Even before she could steady herself, a dozen soldiers broke from the square, their white armor catching firelight as they streaked through the shadows, running towards the river that leads to her home. The remaining soldier stood over the trembling man, his sword still marked by the deaths of those who had already fallen. Accepting his fate, the villager bowed low, forehead nearly touching the earth. A shudder rippled through his body, thin, helpless. His spirit seemed broken, ground down by the terror and despair that smothered the village. Tanjo's stomach twisted, a cold knot tightening until her breath hitched. She wanted to look away, but her eyes refused, dragged forward by the horror of it. The man's trembling seemed to echo inside her own chest, his helplessness pressing against the wild urge in her blood to move, to stop it, to do something. Yet she stayed crouched, every muscle taut, fear and fury knotted together beneath her skin. The soldier shifted. The blade caught the firelight as it rose, gleaming silver and red in the smoke-thick air. For one suspended moment, Tanjo's breath tangled in her throat. Then it fell. Steel cleaved through flesh and bone with a sound that split the night. Snow hissed as blood struck frost, steam rising in a pale spiral that curled toward the stars. Tanjo didn't blink. Couldn't. Her eyes locked wide as the body folded forward, headless, a dark stain spreading across the stones. The man's final cry still echoed in her ears. Her stomach heaved. Bile surged hot in her throat, her body lurching forward before she caught herself, clamping her jaw shut. She'd trained with blades, She'd struck dummies until her arms burned. She'd seen animals slaughtered in the hunt. But never this. Never a man. Death laid bare before her. Not battle, not defense. An ending carried out with ritual calm, as if the soldier's only purpose had been to sever life from body. A scream ripped from one of the houses, a woman's voice, cut short. Another roof gave way, flames leaping skyward in a rush, like a breath drawn too deep. The storehouse, she recognized its frame, collapsed into cinders. Food, medicine, gone in a single plume of smoke. Her fingers curled into the snow, not from fear, from anger, from a rage that burned hotter than the fires devouring the village. She shifted to rise, muscles coiling tight beneath her. The blood roared in her head, pounding with every heartbeat as her eyes swept the devastation below. Fire devoured rooftops, beams splitting and falling in showers of sparks. Soldiers fanned out like hunting dogs, breaking apart into packs, kicking doors from their frames, dragging villagers screaming into the streets. Some were cut down where they stood, their cries lost in the blaze. Others were left alive, only to crumble to their knees, foreheads pressed to the blood-slick stones. A mother clutched her children to her chest, paralyzed by terror, her body rigid as though rooted to the earth. It was not battle. It was butchery. Her chest constricted. She had to run. She had to get home, to warn them. Every instinct screamed, move, now, get back before... A sound. The faint crack of a twig, the brush of pine needles against metal. Her body went still, every muscle tightening as her pulse surged. A shadow pressed against her skin, close enough to feel. There was someone in the woods with her. Tanjo, Volume 1, 7 Shadows.